Welcome to Spectrum's Book Club, and today we discuss Dr. Gil Valentine's Ostriches and Canaries, Coping with Change in Adventism. You can participate with questions and comments on Facebook Live or in the Zoom chat at any time during the hour that we spend together. Meanwhile, please keep your microphone muted, except when you're talking, and raise your hand at 1/2 if you desire to be recognized to engage in the conversation. I see many names and people who mean a lot to the Spectrum community, and I want to take this moment to thank you, many of you who have supported us in our Grow the Vision campaign, where we've recently reached our goal of $1 million in donations and pledges, and we wanted to give Alexander, our new editor, an ample runway to speak and to implement the strategic plan put in place by the board. So thank you so much. With your generosity, we'll create a better website, host a complete journal archive, hire more journalists, and keep sharing the best in Adventism and beyond. We're growing together. Thank you. Our guest today, Dr. Gil Valentine, has written several evocative books that delve into pieces of Adventist leadership and show the interplay between leaders who cope with cultural change, as well as the unfolding of the understanding of the role of Ellen White in the denomination. As I was looking over the books he's written, it seems like they're all about growth. So our Grow the Vision campaign seems timely for this book discussion. He's written J.N. Andrews, Mission Pioneer, Evangelist, and Thought Leader, a fantastic biography of J.N. Andrews, Prophet and the Presidents, and the Shaping of Adventism. Dr. Valentine has served as professor and chair of Department of Leadership and Administration at La Sierra. Welcome, Gil Valentine.
Thanks, Carmen.
I think you have a lot of people here who really love and appreciate you. So I'm
That's
glad.
Encouraging.
Alexander Carpenter is executive editor and executive director of Adventist Forum. And I see you put an excerpt from the book on the website this week that tells about the roots of Adventist Forum. Thank you for what you do, Alexander, and welcome.
No, it's great to be here talking about Gil's book. And for folks who are interested, we have 2 reviews of it in the next issue of the journal and some fun photos from the era as well. So I'm looking forward to this discussion and then as this discussion spills out over the next few months.
Perfect. Thank you. And Bonnie Dwyer is a beloved leader of the Adventist Forum community, and we are indebted to her for her tenacity and kindness as she reported on change and growth in Adventism for over 2 decades as editor of Spectrum. And I'm grateful for her continued engagement with our community. Hi, Bonnie.
Hi, Carmen. Really good to see all of you. It just warms my heart. Greetings from Northern California.
So I wanted to just start this brief overview of the book for those who haven't read it by using the words of Bill Johnson, longtime editor of the Adventist Review. In this book, Gilbert Valentine turns his spotlight on the Pierson presidency of the Adventist Church. The years 1966 through 1978 were tumultuous in American society and also for the church, as ingrained fundamentalism faced the progressive ideas that came with the recently established universities in Loma Linda and Berrien Springs. Pierson could only react to the changes all around by attempting to return to a comfortable past. Suspicion and witch hunts became the order of the day. Many of Adventism's finest minds were purged. It was not the church's finest hour. I highly recommend this book. And like the other case studies to which Dr. Valentine has pointed, this book is about growth and change, and also brings up the idea of identity. Who gets to define the components of identity that make a person a Seventh-day Adventist? And, you know, we typically devolve into 2 views, conservative versus liberal. And I might suggest as we begin this discussion that we would perhaps be wise to say yes to both viewpoints and look for a third way. The Latin root of conserve is to keep safe and preserve from loss and decay. The etymology of progressive reveals the idea of growth or going forward. And how can we say yes to one path without acknowledging the value of the other? So these two strands, conservative and liberal, will be in tension in any group. One side may seem to have power, but the group is only healthy if there is a loyal opposition to keep the group on course, growing, but preserving the core. First Peter, which we discussed in our Sabbath school class this morning, refers to Jesus as the rock, but people who come to Christ are living stones. Living connotates growth, a dynamic concept, and tensions. So I'll start this discussion with two questions for Dr. Valentine. Your books on Adventist history reflect your interest in change and leadership. So I just wondered, is this piece that's highlighted in Ostriches and Canaries a particularly unique example as a metaphor, or is it more applicable to many contexts of leadership and change? And what would you think are the key traits of a successful leader in a time of change? Thank you.
Well, they're big questions, Carmen. We could fill the hour with those easily. Thank you. First of all, let me just back up and say thank you for the invitation to join in the conversation today, and thank you for seeing value in the book. I'm really encouraged by that. Thank you to Alex and the others in Adventist Forum for encouraging other people to read the book by your promotion of it. That is really encouraging. It's not a perfect book. I'm sure it has some gaps because the 1960s and 70s was in fact a very complex period. And there's a lot to tell about the period. So perhaps this book is really just making a start. And George Knight suggests that, we haven't really studied this period in depth at all. And just jumping in with this book is I hope, a good way to start. But let me address your other question, Carmen, whether this is a unique period or somewhat similar to other periods in Adventism. I think the 1960s and 70s, if not unique, was certainly a distinctive period in American history and in Adventist church history. I mean, there were waves of change, huge waves of change washing over society and washing through the church, impacting the church in remarkable ways, eroding its boundaries and reshaping it. It's the period, for example, where Alvin Toffler, writing in 1970, issues his book, Future Shock. And his idea of future shock was that waves of change were pouring over society so frequently, we'd hardly gotten used to the last wave and another wave was crashing on the beach. So the future was arriving too soon. And then a decade later, he wrote the book, The Third Wave, in which he was encouraging people not to be behind the crest of the wave of change, because that way you're always struggling to catch up. But somehow we needed to be on the crest of the wave or just a little in front of the wave so that we were surfing into the future. I mean, that's his metaphor of the third wave. But the idea of future shock, which was a term that he coined, relates to the idea of culture shock. The sense of discombobulation you get when you move from one country to another, when everything's different and it's taking a great deal to adjust to it. Well, people in the 1960s and 70s felt like that. They were suffering from future shock, and certainly Elder Pierson was. Elder Pierson experienced not only culture shock coming back into America from those many years overseas, and while he had many challenges overseas, cultural challenges and challenges of administration. He felt he'd gotten a little out of touch with what was really happening in America, and he struggled to keep up with that change. Was it unique? Yeah, it was distinctive, but in fact, I think Adventism has been confronted with waves of change from its very beginning, and that's encouraging in a sense. I did a recent study on the first couple of decades of Adventism, where I was looking at how Adventists attempted to explain the delay in the Advent during the first 2 or 3 decades. And they went through one explanation after another, because the one that they adopted at first didn't last very long. In fact, all of the 7 explanations for the delay had a built-in shelf life. They would last for a little while and then sort of didn't work anymore. So we had to adjust to change from the very earliest days. And of course, James White was an agent of change, an entrepreneur, a visionary, who helped the church adjust to its thinking, adjust to its interpretation of scripture, to accommodate organization, which we thought was Babylon, but then, oh no, it's a good thing after all. So there are many examples like that of change in our past. But the 60s and 70s, I think, was a distinctive period because of the intensity of change and the fact that we were struggling to cope with large-scale change in our frameworks of thinking, in the paradigms that we were having to use to think about things. And that sort of was a lot more threatening, I think, than earlier change. That's a long-winded answer, sorry. Oh, you also asked about a leader. What are the good qualities of a leader to be able to cope with change? There is, in fact, an enormous literature on the theory of change that is well worth reading. Any good leader today should be well read in the literature of change. We've moved from understanding the dynamics of change, the Toffler era, trying to understand change from a sociological perspective, to managing change. And now the books that leaders in educational administration, for example, are expected to read are how to lead change, not just manage it, but how to lead change. Because change, in fact, is inevitable. We can't avoid it. To live is to grow, and to grow is to change. And a good leader has to understand the dynamics of that from a sociological perspective, and also to feel comfortable with it. A leader who's a good communication person, whose language is inclusive, who's a visionary. I mean, I'm throwing out all these concepts about what it is to be a good leader. But a visionary, entrepreneurial person whose language is inclusive, who's not fearful of change. They may be cautious of change, but they are future oriented, not past oriented, because change is inevitable, organizationally, society-wide, and even our concepts, our deepest convictions are finding new ways of being expressed, and we need to do that. So a good leader is a good communicator. They have to know how to speak with what I call strategic ambiguity. That is, their language needs to be not polarizing and divisive, but inclusive, and to talk in terms that many people with perhaps slightly different perspectives can still find a unity with. For me, that's the key issue of effective leadership of change and leadership of the modern organization. Well, here's my sermon for the day. Sorry.
We loved it. And it sounds like the leader who would be effective during change can tell a better story with the words that are inclusive and forward-looking. And yes, I think this is great. I want to turn to Bonnie, who has been a good leader during change for Spectrum, and give you an opportunity, Bonnie, to ask some questions.
Well, I first want to thank Gil for this book. It just was so affirming to read a piece of Adventist history that felt like my history. So much of Adventist history it's just the 1840s and that period between 1844 and 1900, and then it kind of disappears. And I have always felt kind of outside of it. And your book helped me feel inside of Adventist history and gave a place to the story that I love and cherish. And so I thank you very much. And I want to continue talking about change. A couple of things. One of the things that I think I noticed after I started editing and being in touch with people who would, at certain points in time in their experience with Adventism, they would leave for whatever reason. You know, they got kicked out in high school, and so they left the church. And but then, 20 years later, whatever, something happens and they come back. And they expect to find the same church that they left when they were in high school. But the church has changed. It's not that it's become more liberal, more conservative, whatever, but it has changed. And so their conversation about the church is always kind of a beat off, because they're still talking about the church that they left 20 years ago. And so I think change happens no matter what. And I think what is intriguing about this period of time in Adventism is that the change is happening inside, and it's not coming from the world at us, it's happening within our own community. And I think that seems to have thrown Pierson significantly. It was, what do I do with all these people inside the church? He spent his whole life evangelizing and all of that, but then he's challenged by what's going on inside and not able to handle that well. And so that whole milieu sets up all kinds of situations with individual people that you tell the stories of. And I'm trying to understand what's the best way as people within the church for our conversations among ourselves and with our leaders. The place that I particularly found intriguing in the book was your description of William Peterson and Don McAdams' research into the Great Controversy. They each did major research projects on Great Controversy. Peterson does his research, publishes it, kind of startles everybody, but it's out there. McAdams does his research, only tells a few people, and then buries it. And that conversation goes on for years, 8 years. It's going back and forth between McAdams and the White Estate. So what's the right approach? Is it to do research, get it out there, and just let it land and pick up the pieces where they may? Or what's the best way for us as a community to know how to deal with what we find when we research and how we talk about it with leaders? What do you think?
Wow. Explosions and hand grenades, or the dripping away of the tap slowly. That's a good question, Bonnie. And we've had experience of both, haven't we?
Yeah.
Not just Peterson who went public, but of course the bigger explosion that was caused when Des Ford went public.
Yeah.
And the going public was the problem. Not so much what he said, because we could have coped with that. In fact, people shared the perspective all around the church on that one, even though they might not have agreed with him. But going public ended up being perhaps more destructive. And yet, was that the only way that we would come to terms with the issue? I don't know. Personally, I think that an approach that slowly educates the church and allows for different perspectives within the community, and that those different perspectives are not perceived as threatening. And that's a culture that needs to be created. And we were lacking that culture in the 60s and 70s. We'd come through a period where everything was locked down and everybody had to believe exactly the same way. And so the culture itself worked against accommodating differences of opinion. I mean, we had the Daniel Committee, and people, very informed people, recognized problems and were able to cope with them within their own frameworks, within the small circles. But we didn't feel comfortable going beyond and going outside. I am hoping that there has been a change of culture in the years since then, and that we are able to cope with discussions that introduce new information and new facts and let them settle and let us reflect on them. I think Spectrum's had a very important role in helping us to do that, Adventist Today as well. And I would like us to think of Spectrum and Adventist Today as being on the inside, not on the periphery and on the outside, but legitimate voices within the community in which we're talking to each other and we're putting up information that we have to come to terms with, because it is part of the complexity of reality. It is part of the phenomenon of the world in which we live. And Spectrum is able to help introduce those pieces of information, and leadership needs to be not threatened by that. Now, it's easy to say, I'm not a leader, but I think Spectrum has an educational role as well as a fellowship role. And that the church needs to recognize that and value it. I don't know where I was somewhere recently. I did a study on how the Anglican Church processed its major change in coming to terms with the ordination of women to the priesthood. And they managed that change in a very careful and thoughtful way. And they had the Church Times, which was in a publication for the high church. And then they had another publication for the low church, for the evangelical branch of the church. Neither was regarded as outside the fold, but they were voices within, and they benefited, and they brought people from those journals into the conversation. We've not learned to do that, and we'll be a healthier and a richer community if we can do that, I think. End of sermon again. Sorry, tell me to stop preaching.
That's why we're here. We want to hear
enthusiastic.
We want to hear your thoughts. Alex, what are you thinking as you hear the discussion?
First, amen, brother. Thank you. And when I first heard you present this, I was transfixed by the narrative that you're telling, and it's, the Adventist Forum story in really, I think, significant ways. It helped me understand myself better. It helped me understand my parents better, and it helped me understand my church better. So thank you personally for that, Gil. And while I was reading, I got to the part where the president of the General Conference is concerned about the facial hair of students on campus at Andrews. And it was just one of those, hilarious moments of the petty and the personal, but also, there's anxiety there. He wasn't able to kind of understand what this change meant. And I took a picture of it, and one of the people that you mentioned there who was growing their facial hair too long for the comfort of the leader of the remnant church was our friend Ray Dabrowski, who then became communication director for the General Conference. So I just love that bit of irony. And there's a bit of irony when I think about the story. We kind of in the kind of Adventist forum spectrum world approach these questions, thanks to our historians, with a bit of irony, a little bit of distance. We can understand people are working their way through a relationship with God and each other, and let's give people a little bit of space to figure things out. I don't think that Pierson had much irony at his disposal. And he's not the only one. And I'm wondering, as you have spent so much time thinking about leadership, it seems like in your telling of it, he said, hey, I can handle Robert Brinsmead. I can handle folks on the right. We don't need to worry about them. I know their language. I'm comfortable with them. What really concerned him was the language that he didn't understand. And I'm wondering if you have, will this continue? And I know historians hate a prophetic question, but this is a story that happens in the 60s and 70s, but it's happened in the 80s and in the 90s in local areas and on through to this point around the world. Is there any hope here? Can we help leaders understand that both, all parts of Adventism are interested in exploring the truth, the present truth of who we are as a community in healthy ways, or are we always going to be that scary wing of the church to an administrator?
Yeah, I don't know. I have a hunch, Alexander, that the scariness from intellectuals is now baked into the church, and it's come to stay. When we make decisions corporately and as a community, there are often consequences, and there are results from those decisions, sometimes which come much later down, which we don't anticipate, but we have to live with them, and they are, in fact, they make us who we are. So when we first embarked on establishing a college in 1874 in Battle Creek, what prompted the establishment of that college was really the fact that there might be some people coming from Switzerland who spoke French, and goodness, we need to have our train people to speak a foreign language, because the church is soon going to be expanding overseas. So it was growth and the challenge of further development that led to the establishment of Battle Creek College. And then in the 30s and 40s, the rising educational standards in society, as I explained in the book, that put enormous pressure on the church, and it was very difficult for us to cross the bridge of accreditation, to commit to that, because we feared a loss of identity. But eventually we were kind of forced to cross it because our graduates of our college had to have professional recognition, not just in the medical field, but as teachers, and we felt as ministers as well. So pressures from outside of society kind of forced us in a direction. And that in a sense is what's happened along the way since. I mean, it's been pressures from outside society that forced us to reevaluate the role of women in society and within the church. And it's been the people that have been educated that have helped us. That might sound arrogant, and well, I need to be careful about that, because we should avoid that. But, well, as Ritland said to Hamill and to Neil Wilson, we need the theologians to help us cross bridges and to cope with shifting understandings. They are the people that we need. And while there was a temptation to exclude them because they felt threatening, I think we have come to the place where we realize that we need our thinking people with graduate education, because people generally are thinking more broadly and more deeply. I've wandered around off your question. I've even forgotten what it was, Alex. But I think the secret is that education itself, our commitment to education, has guaranteed that we're going to have thinking people as part of the community, at least from that source, if from no other. But of course, they come from all over beyond as well. And that's the nature of the changing society that we're called to minister to. So I'm hopeful about intellectuals not continuing to be threatening, maybe to some. Leaders need to read. If we could have leaders who are prepared to read broadly, more broadly than just Ellen White and Scripture, then they will be the kind of people who understand the questions that others are asking. And without that reading, then we are in trouble. It's true. So maybe we ought to give a reading test. Maybe one of the first questions we ought to ask a new president of a conference or a university or a GC, tell me about the last 3 books you've read and what did you find helpful about them?
Yeah.
First question on the interview. Sorry.
Thank you. When I started with my first question, I was trying to understand, if this was a unique time that you write about. And, as we've spoken more together, I've realized that the Adventist Church has, from the beginning, as you pointed out, we had to reckon with the great disappointment. But we also, I think, like no other denomination, have had to reckon with the track of education, yet trying to be true to the original founding beliefs. And I mean, like, what other denomination has a medical school that, it's premier? And so we have that within our culture, but yet we also have this fear of learning. So there's that tension that makes us unique. And then I was also thinking, we have Ellen White and reckoning with her inspiration and the meaning of her writings. So we're in kind of a special corner with given who we are. And so I just wondered if you would comment on that.
There is a strong strand, I think, Carmen, you've identified, of anti-intellectualism in the church. Where does that come from? I'm not sure. Perhaps from our origins, where we were fearful of sophisticated people with creeds and sophisticated systems of belief, and we were just simple people of the Bible and reading it plainly, and we only needed that. In one sense, I guess we have a spiritual gift in our midst that's been a mixed blessing. I think we have to be honest and willing to acknowledge that. That spiritual gift frightened us off academic study in one way. Psychology was science, so-called. Geology was science, so-called. Don't waste your money on the dust heaps of archaeology. I mean, all good counsel from Ellen White. And yet she fostered our need for education. So all of us are bundles of paradoxes and contradictions. And there, I think, we have it even within this gift that has been so valuable to us and yet has created problems for us in one way. So the nurturing of anti-intellectualism has sometimes come from the prophet herself. And I think we need to move beyond that. We are. And maybe because many of our new believers that come in, won by evangelists, are brought into the church on the basis of very certain, very clearly asserted dogmatic assumptions, and they've come into the church through a journey of trauma, a background perhaps of dysfunction, and here now we're settled, we've got security and stability at last, and I'm going to hold on to that and not change anymore. So that all, I think, contributes to this mix of commitment to education and yet an inherent anti-intellectualism. And both are true together. That's the paradox of who we are.
Thank you. We wanted to invite our participants here to speak and ask a question, and I see one hand. Ron Graybill, can you go first?
Yeah, I don't really have a question, but I want to urge a little humility on our part in thinking that we understand where we are now and what will happen in the future. I was working in the newsroom in Cobo Hall in 1966 when Robert Pierson was elected. And my cousin Herb Ford was in charge of that time. And I remember, I thought of Elder Figure as such an old fuddy-duddy. And I thought this was a great thing. We were going to have this new blood, and Robert Pierson was going to be elected. And now I read Gil's book, and I find out how naive I was then, and maybe still am naive about some of the things that are going on. Pierson very soon afterwards was coming to Andrews University and called me into Hamill's office to chide me for my articles that I'd written in the student movement, which had even been so controversial that the Southern Missionary College paper republished them to show what heretics we were at Andrews. And I remember Elder Pierson saying at the end of our interview, "Well, Brother Graybill, some of us still believe that Jesus is coming soon." I don't know, 50 years ago. So, we're still, the great disappointment in Adventism is the great disappointment that has occurred every year since 1844. But we're beginning now to hear more and more voices on how to cope with that change and with that phenomenon and live to be comfortable with it. So anyway, it's delightful to be here with all of you and to have the insights of Gil's book.
Thank you. I see we also have a question from Harry Allen here on Zoom.
Thank you, Carmen. Gilbert Valentine, thank you very much for your book and for your ideas. I've not yet read your book, but I have started reading the excerpt in Spectrum, and it appears really, really fascinating. So thank you for it. I have two questions, and I can ask them both or one after the other if you like, whichever you prefer.
Yeah, take them together. I'll try and remember.
Sure thing. So the first question is, why did you write this book?
Yeah.
First question. The second question is, when you look back at Adventism historically in the way you have, what do you see the period that you cover, or I should say it this way, what do you see in the present period that parallels the period you cover and that makes you think, we missed it that time, we may miss it again this time? If my question is clear.
Thank you. Yeah, good questions, Harry. Thank you. And I hope you enjoy the book when you get to read it. I'm sure you will.
I expect I will.
Why did I write it? I didn't actually plan to write it in one sense. It wasn't on my agenda. I had been asked to write a couple of articles for the new encyclopedia that the General Conference was preparing, the online encyclopedia. One of those articles was Glacier View, and the other was Palmdale. And I must acknowledge that that was a brave request on the part of the GC to ask a Gil Valentine to write those articles, which I think is kind of a, if I might say so, a vote of confidence on the part of the editors of the encyclopedia that we can cope with broader viewpoints these days. Not about me, but that people that have said some things that have been disconcerting in the past, they will still welcome to to write an article. So it was in preparation for those two articles that I began to read some of the background. I mean, Glacier View happened in 1980. It was a response to an explosion that happened in 1979. And I felt that I needed to understand at least a couple of decades before that to help set the context for a scholarly understanding of Glacier View. So I was doing research in the background. I read Cottrell's assessment of the background, his commentary on the decade of obscurantism that led up to the episode in 79 in Glacier View. And then I went back a little further to say, okay, what led up to that episode, that decade? And as I was reading through the correspondence of Robert Pierson in preparation for those articles, I encountered this recurring theme about creeping liberalism and intellectuals that were being threatening to the church. I mean, just letters that I was reading about other topics completely, and just part of the general background. I was surprised at the frequency that those kind of phrases and those kind of concepts came up in Pierson's general correspondence. And then as I read further, I read about these specific actions that he was taking, like calling in a committee of his closest confidence to talk about trends in the church that were worrying the church. And he would list all of the items. And on the list of items, there would be Ron Grable's article in the student movement or some other issue, the short skirts in the General Conference. On one list of trends in the church, I saw a handwritten item about coffee machines or coffee kettles being hidden away in professors' closets in their office, even in the GC. So these kinds of things were on the list of things that troubled Pierson. And after I'd finished those two articles for the encyclopedia, I said, there's an article to be written about this issue in Pierson's correspondence. So I said, here's a 40-page article I'm going to write, and maybe Spectrum will publish it. Well, lo and behold, when I got to do the research in more detail, I discovered that there was not just one chapter, but 2 chapters, 3 chapters, and finally, the book ended up at 450 pages. So that's a long story, Harry, but that really is why I chose the period. And I bracketed the period of Pierson's administration because it really initially was the administration that set up the context for Glacier View and Dallas, the Statement of Fundamental Beliefs. And his administration, of course, had been built on administrations beforehand. So that led to what lay behind Pierson's administration. So yeah, that was the first question. And already I've forgotten your second.
The second question was, when you look at our contemporary period.
Yeah, okay, thanks.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, how does it relate to the current era?
Do you see something that you're saying now that based on what we didn't do in the past or did do, when you look at now, you say we're in trouble here or we could be? Based on how we're handling the relationship, the administration's relationship to scholars or to the general populace, you see a similar thing happening that you say could be trouble in the future?
I think it's a mix of both, Harry. I think there's a troubling development, or at least there was, because there was an attempt for a while to impose compliance. That was characteristic of the Pierson administration. And he took several specific strategies, adopted strategies to ensure compliance that weren't quite as, forgive me, crass as the recent ones about trying to achieve compliance on women's ordination. But I'm hopeful that those attempts to achieve compliance have been demonstrated to be ineffectual, and that we are moving beyond them. I may be pipe dreaming, but I'm hopeful of that. And then the other thing that encourages me that I think we might avoid the calamities of the past, particularly the calamity of 1979, 1980, is that increasingly in the church, there are places of safety for discussions of sensitive issues, where people can voice an alternative viewpoint in an effort to come to terms with discomforting facts and new information. I mean, I've sat in on a class out at Avondale electronically, Zoom E14, which talks fairly frankly about the problems of chronology, forwards and backwards. I occasionally sit in on a class at PUC, a class at Sligo, each where there is a willingness to confront difficult information and not to put people down or to exclude them or to say you're no longer part of the community if you try and find an explanation for that information in this way, which may threaten some traditional perspective. I see that in a number of different places across the church. And if that can continue to happen, and in places like Spectrum and at Adventist Today, and I think there may be groups in South America and certainly in Africa that will be springing up as people are being educated there, I think there will be a way of avoiding the calamities of the past. I'm hopeful and prayerful that will occur. Thank you for your question.
Thank you very much for your answers. Thank you.
Thank you. I think Alexander saw an interesting question on Facebook.
Yeah, we've got about 20 people watching live on Facebook as well. And Anthony Daniels, who's obviously read the book already, says there's a striking passage in the book on page 296. Quote, Pierson and Hackett returned to the drawing board, but were determined to hold their ground. Administration, in their view, must control the church's theology. And I think that's one of the really great stories that you tell, Gil, is you make it very clear that Pierson intended to be the determiner for what Adventist theology was. Can you talk about, as someone who kind of told that story, what were his motivations and where did he go wrong in trying or maybe overreaching in with the goodest, with very pure motives in a lot of ways, unlike some others who were involved who were a little disingenuous. He felt like he was doing the right thing and he was going about it so wrong.
Yeah. I think Pierson actually inherited a tradition on this, maybe from W.H. Branson, and maybe from people earlier, but at least Branson saw what was happening among the Bible scholars in the church. I mean, out there at PUC, they had this Bible Scholars Fellowship, what do they call it? Bible Research Fellowship, that actually eventually grew to be quite a large group without control by the church. Even though that group had sought to work in cooperation with the church and under the umbrella of the seminary, and they were exploring some difficult issues, some new explanations, some new information coming from biblical study. And Branson was threatened by that and felt that he had to close it down and establish any research that was going to be undertaken by the church under the control of the church at the General Conference. And I tell that story in the book, the shift of the end of the Bible Research Fellowship and the establishment of the Biblical Research Institute. Pierson's approach to it was similar to Branson's. And I think it was fear that drove it. A fear that we would lose our identity and a fear that he would lose control. So fear is mirrored by the need to control. If you can control what's making you fearful, then you can resolve your fears. And I don't know, but I suspect that part of the background to that is also baked into our tradition. With our repeated narrative of the shaking and the time of trouble. And the time will come when the bright lights in the church will be shaken out. I mean, that narrative, the narrative of the omega of apostasy, keeps coming back and back. And that frightened Pierson, genuinely caused him to lose sleep at night. I mean, this was palpable fear that robbed him of sleep. And so the only way he felt he could prevent the shaking, even though he anticipated it. And there's a paradox, isn't there? That's a conundrum. But to control and to say, well, it really is the administration of the church. They're the appointed leaders. They're the ones that need to determine what the church needs to believe. We are the inheritors of the tradition. In a sense, if I can put my church history hat on, we're going back to the 2nd century, with the emergence of the monarchical bishop. It's the bishops that determine what the church believes, not the people that are reading scripture in the local congregations. It's the bishops. And so Pierson was sort of just being natural in that way, I guess, following tradition. And hopefully we can work our way through that. And I think today we are. I think no matter how much today the BRI tries to impose a way of thinking is so dispersed in the church that it's happening anyway, in the colleges and in the congregations and in small groups like this. And that's encouraging. And I think perhaps one of the great contributions that Gottfried Oosterwal brought to the church was the role of the laity, and that church leadership was important, and a clerical dominated church is not a good thing. Clerics in the church are valuable and important, but the laity involvement in administration and in the thinking, the theological reflection, I think he did us a great service, and we can be very thankful for that. Yeah. Who was I talking to on that one? Oh, Alexander. Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you. We typically keep it at an hour, but we're having such a great time. We will extend it, stretch over, if that's okay with you, Dr. Valentine, to
Sure. I've got all afternoon.
A little more. Okay. I have a question sent to me, direct message, and then we'll go to John Brunt, Andrew Skeggs, and Larry Garrity. So the question Terry Dunder sent to me was, what would being on the front of the wave potentially look like for a Christian, which would provide universal appeal? I think he's talking about your analogy of surfing with change. And have you imagined what that would look like?
For the Adventist Church today, to be on the front edge of the wave rather than scrambling behind and trying to catch up and saying, oh, are we doing the right thing, would be an awareness of a ministry in justice, in social justice, and a ministry to equality. Those are the things that society is struggling with in a range of areas. Poverty, in gender, and in prejudice, and in discrimination. The gospel in practice, our judgment message concerned with justice. For me, that would be a very important front edge of the wave. The wave may have passed us by on women and the equality of women, but we're kind of catching up with that. And we say we're not shaped by society. That's a myth. There's never a time when we're not shaped by society. We are a conservative voice in society, but we are not immune from what's happening around us. And we respond to society, and in many places we should lead, but often we don't.
Thank you. John Brunt, do you have a question?
Yes, first of all, thank you, Gil. I have told you before how much I appreciated this book, and just thank you so much for writing it. I thoroughly enjoyed reading it. My question is this: as I read the book, I was impressed with the fact that there were these different responses from the people who were under fire. Some of the people who were under fire stayed in their positions and finished out their careers right where they were. Some of the people got pushed out of their positions, but stayed in denominational employment and made significant contributions elsewhere, like what Sakai Kubo did with the library, even though he wasn't allowed to teach. Some left denominational employment, but remained very faithful Adventists. I think of Harold Weiss, for instance, and made contributions elsewhere. And some chose to leave the Adventist communion altogether and made contributions in other Christian communions. I'm wondering, as you think of those different responses and the different stories that you told of people in all four of those categories, if you see some kind of pattern as to what made the difference. Did it have to do with the personality of the individuals? Was it perhaps the kind of immediate supervisors they had, the kind of community that was around them? Or was it just plain dumb luck and circumstances?
Yeah, thoughtful question, John, and a complex one. And I think it addresses actually a set of complex phenomena all related together. It reminds me in one sense of the New Testament story of Stephen, who shot his mouth off, and lost his life under a pile of rocks, and a group of administrators in Jerusalem who stayed put and survived, and the rest of the church believers being scattered abroad. I mean, there are three responses there. One lost his life, others had to leave home and flee. And I don't know what it was about the apostles that kept their tongues and their heads, but they were able to stay put in Jerusalem. The same sort of dynamic, as you've pointed out, happened with these people in Adventism. And I think it reflects possibly, one, the personality and the temperament of the person, for one thing. Some people were willing to submit, others were more feisty and couldn't submit in quite the same way for a sense of integrity. There were others for whom life circumstances proposed some very uncomfortable choices. I think, for example, Vel Hilgert, who was confronted with a very difficult life choice. If he loved teaching, he was called to teaching, he was brilliant at it, and yet if he stayed where he was, he would lose his sustentation. What do you do in those circumstances? And then his wife was already at McCormick and connected with the Presbyterians. So, yeah, I think life circumstances contributes somewhat. And then I think also perhaps the challenge that the administrator faces, trying to keep the temperature, turning the gas back on the burner to keep the temperature down, by adopting strategies that involve shifting Sakai Kubo into library work, but couldn't cope with Ted Vick, who he had to let go, found reasons to, good reasons, but others felt that it was a tragic loss. So I think a mix of all three things, or maybe and many more besides probably. It's not even one simple thing that leads to the departure, but any loss is tragic, really. And if we can create a culture and an environment that is inclusive, that can cope with the increase in temperature, but reduce it where it's necessary, and embrace people of different viewpoints, we are the richer community, and our accomplishment of mission will be much more effective. Thanks, John. I don't know if that answers it all, but
that's helpful.
Somewhat, yeah.
It's beautiful, beautiful vision. Andrew Skaggs, your turn.
Thanks for your book and a lot of your recent research, Gil. You you managed to bring out what happens behind the scenes of a lot of tumultuous events. I appreciate that. I sort of sense that in some ways you're echoing Martin Luther King. You know, the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice.
Yeah.
And I sort of, interesting reading through the book of these events 50 years ago, because you can sense in some ways the church has changed. Like, we apparently don't have a problem with beards anymore, so that's good. In other ways, like on the creation science issues, it sounds like the same things that are being debated today, you know, and we haven't really changed a lot in our openness. And I sort of suspect there are some issues that the church really resists change, and there are others where we go, oh, we can probably change. I don't know if you have any reflection on, you know, is the art of change bending, or is some of it maintaining rigid?
Yeah, good question, Andrew, and very thoughtful. There are some people that don't like the word progressive. You know, they can't get past the political dimensions of the term, and they think that it may sound a little self-congratulatory or a little arrogant. And in fact, I was reading an article, was it in the New York Times just this last week, that progressive may be falling out of favor. Social democrat may be the new term that they're looking for. But in terms of our context, I've wondered about whether progressive is the right way, and maybe we should call ourselves benders, benders of the arc of that projects into the future. And you're right. I think the arc, the moral arc, in some cases is shorter, in some cases it's longer. Still an arc, and it still needs being bent. And on the issue of chronology and how we understand the complexity of the creation story, I think the arc is going to be long rather than short. But it will bend, I'm absolutely sure, eventually. Because the phenomenon, the reality, the complexity of reality, we can't get around. I've just been reading this book this week. John Butler introduced us to it, the Red Dynamite. Larry just got it this week, and Ron's already begun to read it. The story of how Adventism had a central role to play in the birth of young Earth creationism. Ellen White and George Macready Price, Whitcomb Morris, and those others much later, but how Adventism is the source of that idea, really. And we've kind of been driven into a cul-de-sac on this one with Ellen White, who was wanting to emphasize creation and a plain reading. And I don't know, maybe the only way out of that cul-de-sac is to go round and round inside it for a few times before we find the exit. But just as that book, the Red Dynamite, shows that eventually change comes because we have to confront the reality of facts. Even on that, I think, if we can find the power of the creation theology and the creation story, and, you know, I'm even inclined to think we were required to read, when I was at college, the articles by F.D. Nichol on the increasing timeliness of the third angel's message, the three angels' messages. And the thrust of those articles was these messages of Revelation 14:6 are addressing the problem of creation, and they're against evolution. And it's very timely, because just when evolution came up, we were called to proclaim a message against evolution. That's the theme of our creationism. If we could recapture the timeliness of our creation theology again, but in its much more realistic, complex, rich theological perspective, we would have a contribution to make, and an increasingly timely one. Creation. It may have happened in different ways than we've traditionally thought. But so that arc, that moral arc, that theological arc might be a longer one, but I think we can all bend on it, and that will help to shorten it. That's my dream anyway, Andrew. And all the best to you and your ministry in West Australia there.
Thank
Nice
you,
to
Gil.
see you
Yeah,
guys.
thanks for what you're doing. I think one of the themes in your writing is that there's always a fight, but some battles are worth winning. So thank you.
Yes, indeed.
You know, as a student of human rights, I've been thinking about your vision of the timeliness of our message and, you know, creation. And it just seems to me that it's that each person has the image of God, and it's kind of like the value of each person in a way could be the, you know, the timeliness in this moment when we seem to prioritize different groups of people. But anyway, I'm no theologian. Larry Garrity, you have a question or a comment.
Yes, I'll make it a comment. I know that we're pressed for time here. Wanted to thank you to Gil for your work as an illustration of its value and positive impact. Is the fact that 3 hours ago, Jillian and I went to church in Redlands, and John Brunt's associate is the interim pastor there, Alger Keogh, and he held up your book.
Wow.
And talked about it. He sort of reviewed the book and its message
In church.
in church in a very positive way, and used it as an illustration of how important it is for us to rub ideas off on one another. That he used the idea of iron and steel becomes stronger when you're rubbing up against it, you know. And so he recommended the book and talked about its importance so that we don't relive all the fights of the past, but we learn to listen and to learn and to help each other grow where some of us may be short-sighted. So be of good courage. Your efforts are paying off.
Thanks, Larry. That's an encouraging story, isn't it? There's good reason to be optimistic. Thank you indeed.
So Alex, were there a few other questions or comments?
Yeah, we've got one from Dr. Elton Kerr, who asks, what significance did Vatican II have on the changes that were occurring within the Seventh-day Adventist Church? And you kind of addressed that in your book a little bit. Can you highlight that sort of interesting parallel?
Yeah, that's a thoughtful question. And I didn't look too closely at the impact of what was happening in the Catholic Church. I have looked closely at what's happened in the Baptist Church within America and in the Lutheran Church, the Missouri Synod, both of which parallel the experience of Adventism fairly closely. But I think you're right in seeing a connection between what was happening under Vatican II, in that movement, as I understand it, was a movement to embrace the laity more inclusively in church life and to move away from old forms of worship that were Latin-based and to use the vernacular more frequently and to involve people in the life of the church. And I think probably Gottfried Oosterweel was reflecting some of that context when he was writing his book on Mission Possible and suggesting that the Adventist Church ought to be more or less clerically dominated and have lay people more involved in the life of the church. So that at least is one area. I think Gottfried Oosterweel was also reflecting what was happening in the wider evangelical world with the church growth movement. And the rise of the recognition of gifts in the church, not just the spirit of prophecy, but the gift of hospitality and the gift of helps and the whole range of giftedness. So I think perhaps that also is a reflection of what was happening in Catholicism. And then the other thought that comes to mind is that Rein de Bruinsma has studied this area more closely and looked at the changes in Catholicism and is suggesting that we need to reevaluate our thinking about Catholicism in the light of the councils that was held back in the last several decades. So his writings on that, I think, are very helpful as well. But thank you for the question.
Thank you. I'll just read one more comment here. I don't know, it's from Martin Weber. Gil, I think one of your most important information sources was your access to the personal diary of Siegfried Horn. I think one of the greatest of your book is to resist the current trend to post-date fundamentalism past the death of Ellen White, showing how fundamentalism was a core ingredient of SDA DNA from the beginning.
Bless you, Martin. That's a really encouraging affirmation. There are some who disagree with that point, and they say that Adventism has been much more present truth and progressive and in that mode than the fundamentalist mode. But I'm convinced, as you just highlighted, that at its core, its core conviction related to this biblical literalism and an inerrancy and the eschatology that was built around that. And while we did have this present truth concept and were willing to change and to be open and resisted the idea of creeds, both were held together in a creative tension. And maybe that's the wonder of Adventism. And perhaps we need to keep that together. But there is a danger in holding on to fundamentalism too rigidly, because it's an inadequate way of explaining the complex phenomenon that we confront in our modern world. Yeah, thank you, Martin. I really appreciate the way you've sort of zeroed in on what I think are core ideas of the book. Yeah, thank you.
Well, thank you all for joining. Thank you for being part of this community. This has been a treasured time. Dr. Valentine, thank you for this book and for all the work that you do thinking through pieces of the Adventist history and showing ways that we can learn. You are a treasure for us, and we are grateful. Bonnie and Alex, it's good to have you along for the conversation. Bonnie had sent a list of questions, which I would have loved to gone through with you, Gil Valentine. I mean, we had a great time, but it seems too short, but thank you all. And I wanted to ask you to mark your calendar for the last Sabbath in September, when we will discuss Dr. Jack Haynes' book, Adventist Tomorrow, Fresh Ideas While Waiting for Jesus. Dr. Haynes is a graduate of Loma Linda School of Medicine and has been a missionary. And he is a treasured supporter of Adventist Forum. And so he's seeking to show a synthesis for a way forward. So check out that book and mark your calendar to join us again in a few weeks. Thank you all, and happy Sabbath.
Happy Sabbath.